Okay, welcome back to our second panel now on youth and race. And to lead us, we have famed and excellent PBS news journalist, Ray Suarez, who has a 30-year career in broadcast news, from working for CNN and NBC to being head of or moderator of the Talk of the Nation program on NPR, and now, of course, has long been on the PBS NewsHour. For this panel, we have Lisa Wong, who's mayor of Fitchburg, Massachusetts; Victor Rios, author of the book Punished: Policing the Lives of Black and Latino Boys, and also a professor at University of California, Santa Barbara; Kristal, editor-in-chief of Politics 365; and Christina Downs, who's editor-in-chief of the Hilltop, which is the Howard University newspaper. Ray?
What Charlie was nice enough not to mention was that I am the token non-young member of this panel, providing a little critical distance to a conversation about youth and youth attitudes. I am closely associated with 3 youth who grew up in my house, so I ran sort of a multiple variable experiment of raising them. 2 are young adults and don't live with me anymore, and 1 is a petulant and sulky 13-year-old. So I get to see this from various parts of the timeline. And what interested me in this panel and attracted me to being the moderator of this particular conversation is that as a reporter, I've always been suspicious of widely distributed social ideas. Not because they're necessarily wrong, but I always wonder, my first question is, how do they know that? And is it really true? And one of those widely distributed social ideas, and I'm sure the panelists would all agree, is that youth have tremendously different racial attitudes from their parents. And I grew up at a time where the assumption was you had a lot of the same racial attitudes as your parents, that some of the things that you would hear teenagers and young adults say about race were just recycled versions of things that they heard at the kitchen table. This was a very strong idea in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, as people who were my age were negotiating school integration, negotiating workplaces where for the first time there were going to be employees distributed throughout the company doing jobs where they had never been seen before. So the good news is that even after being a vanguard generation, I'm still pretty old, which means that we've been doing it for a long time. The bad news is, I think if we look at all the other metrics, there's a lot to make us question this idea of whether youth really do have racial attitudes that are that different from older age frames in our society. Victor Rios, is it a measurable question? You're a sociologist. You look at these things. Can we actually say for sure that a young person in this country is likely to have a different set of racial attitudes from the ones that prevailed against people the same age, prevailed among people the same age 20 years ago, 30 years ago?
Yes, well, Alexis de Tocqueville, who studied early America, once said, in democracy, every generation is a new people. And the general social survey and implicit bias test today show that the younger generation, ages 18 to 24 approximately, do have a different understanding of race than their parents and grandparents. And so one example of this is their pluralistic attitudes, particularly among white youth, towards other groups, being more accepting, with immigration reform, for example, being more embracive of it, and with acknowledging that racism is not just a thing of the past, but a thing also of the present. And so this dynamic phenomenon of this younger generation being a little bit more pluralistic does provide some insight and some hope into the future. There are definitely some challenges, though. This generation doesn't understand race in terms of the civil rights struggle, or Malcolm X, or even Rodney King. This generation understands race in terms of the election of President Barack Obama, in terms of Hurricane Katrina, in terms of newer sort of racial dynamics taking place, immigration reform and the immigrant rights struggle. And so, for example, with Katrina, trying to understand why the media reporters, the AP press, would show a picture of an African American grabbing a piece of bread and saying, "Oh, this person's looting," when the same picture of a black and white of a white couple with a loaf of bread, some food from the store, was these people are surviving. They found some food. And really, one of the things I think we need to do as a society is support these young people in their pluralistic attitudes by making sure our institutions are also changing to adjust to their pluralistic attitudes. So teaching multicultural education in schools and civic engagement, and not just teaching to the test.
Christina Downs, for years, social researchers have been asking people about race and asking them the same set of questions over time. So you get wonderful data out of that. And one of the set of questions that people get asked is whether race makes any difference in their daily lives. And it may not surprise you at all to find that white people answer by tremendous majorities that it doesn't really make that much difference in their lives, and that they believe that other people are not burdened by their own racial identities in a way that they may believe themselves to be. So we have to, I guess, for the purposes of this conversation, concede that race operates on a lot of different levels. What people in a racial majority might see when they look around, but also people who are members of racial minorities, what they see when they look out from their own experience to the rest of society. When you look at your fellow undergraduates at Howard, do they see America as a place that's where racial barriers are being lowered, where there's a different dispensation than your own parents may have had?
I think that there's definitely optimism, so I think obviously that's good. I think that Howard's obviously known for being a very politically active campus, and that definitely hasn't changed. I think it's sort of shifted because we don't have, like Victor was saying, you know, the movements in the 60s to sort of guide us. I think one of the things that I wanted to sort of piggyback off of is the frustration that I had growing up, just K through 12 education, of this sort of separation with the civil rights movement and Black History Month, and it's sort of being this thing that gets dusted off with cobwebs but not really applied to our everyday lives. And so I think we lose some of the gold there of learning about our own racial struggles. And also I think that what you will find with undergraduates, you know, of the minority population is a frustration, sort of like you said, where we feel every day that we go through these struggles and we feel that people still have a lot of prejudice and intolerance and ignorance, and then there's this whole population out there that doesn't even recognize it as a problem. So then I feel like you have this furthered misunderstanding to where some people have written off, and you saw this a lot in the election, have written it off as even an issue. You know, why we're in a post-racial society. And then you have other people who are living with racism day to day. So I think it's an interesting struggle, and I think as we graduate, I'm a graduating senior, I think Howard definitely stresses an agenda not only to, you know, be successful in the workforce, but also to have those conversations and to bring that to the table, not in a necessarily militant way, but also to make sure, you know, hey, I'm here, I am of this race, I'm not going to ignore it or deny it, but you know, it's not going to define me. But we do need to have these conversations about our differences to be able to work together.
Mayor, I think if we walked through the halls of City Hall and looked at all the lovely old portraits of the previous 40 mayors of Fitchburg, I'm going to guess that you don't look like any of them. And I don't know whether this is a thing that rocked Fitchburg's world, or wasn't that big a deal, or whether it was something that you had to be very conscious of as a very young politician in a place where you couldn't look back to the previous Mayor Wongs for guidance.
You must have actually walked through the halls of City Hall in Fitchburg because there are large panels of photos, and I will say there is a lot of facial hair in those photos. So certainly I am actually the second female mayor. The first female mayor, Mary Whitney, insisted that her photo on the wall be colored. And I think that that was something that was actually taken down, changed to black and white, and then she had to, after her term, fight to bring back the colored version. And I think the idea there was to say, well, things look nice when they're uniform. And what she said is, this is significant in the history of Fitchburg. It should stand out. So I was proud that in my first year as mayor, one of the first acts that we did is actually take down the black and white photograph of Mary Whitney and be able to put up a colored photo of her. That's very symbolic. I think what people see visually impacts them greatly. However, that doesn't necessarily translate into the conversations. And that's why, as a political leader, we actually have to take conversations that we know might be happening in people's heads or behind the scenes and figure out how to flush those out into the open. I'll give you an example. I knocked on over 5,000 doors in 2007 when I was first elected. Not a single person raised a question or commented on my age, my gender, or my ethnicity. So what does that say? I can bet you that my age, my race, and my ethnicity was on the minds of many voters, yet they didn't bring it up in those conversations.
So they're polite.
They're polite.
We know about Fitchburg people that they're polite.
Well, I also find that there's something that trumps that. What trumps that is this idea of trust and motivation. So what individuals were more curious about was how long I actually lived in that community. Because I didn't look like somebody they grew up with, they wanted to know, well, how long have you been in this community? How much do you know about this community? How much do you care about this community? And therefore, we think that that is the single biggest indicator of how you can lead this community. So actually getting to those discussions and maybe looking different enable them to ask those questions. So if I looked like any other mayor with a lot of facial hair answering the door when they opened it, maybe they would have just assumed those things. Assumed that because I look like them that I understood that, and therefore maybe have superficial conversations, which I saw in previous elections of your resume of how many Little League teams you coached, how long you've lived in the city, which elementary schools you went to. Those dominated the descriptions of the politicians. So by, I would say, being somebody that looks different, there was a lot of questions, not just about where you went to school. I think there was an assumption, well, I didn't go to school with you. Then it was, okay, let's talk about other important things. But that being said, we don't always want to be reactive. So in understanding that of 5,000 doors I knocked on, no one asked those questions, I knew that those are questions that had to be exposed, especially when I go into the schools. And I knock on those doors in those classrooms and I see people that look like me. And I think these are where the conversations need to have. There's still a big chasm between the doors that I knock on in terms of who's on the voter list and the kids that are growing up and that we're educating in our schools. And those are the conversations that we're having here, and these are the conversations that we're having in our city halls.
Kristal, when you look at public opinion surveys that are broken out by age, some of the attitudes given to opinion researchers are so different that you think, well, it's tempting to think that time will just take care of some of this stuff. That if we just let the gray hairs die out the back end and these people who are 18 to 35 who are telling opinion researchers this very different story of America, a lot of this is going to get taken care of. Yet, you don't hear very many people just saying, well, just wait and this will take care of itself. There is still a feeling that, no, we have to have these hard conversations and face up to who we are and who we want to be. Are kids that different? Do you see them as being different?
Well, so I think the conundrum of youth and race in America today really has a lot more to do with the images that are projected upon us, right? Whether that's from the images we see in the media, whether that's the assumptions people make about who we are based on how we look, as opposed to what our experience has been growing up because of our socioeconomic status. And so, you know, when you start thinking about public opinion polls and you're saying, oh, well, young people today, they don't believe in racism. It's a different kind of racism that we face. It's not as hit you over the head, you know, that say my parents experienced as they were integrating their schools, right? It's the kind of thing that says there is a history, there is a legacy here in which people of color have historically faced sometimes insurmountable odds in this country, but we like to dismiss that, right? So it's a different kind of dynamic that I think young people today face, particularly when in an increasingly multicultural space, you're trying to define identity, right? It's hard enough to say as a young person, I am X, Y, or Z, but when you compound that with this notion of, well, I am a black girl that grew up, you know, middle class in Miami, I went to private schools, what does that even mean versus I'm a girl walking down the street with a large afro? You know, so it's the type of attitudes that are projected upon youth based on what we just see visually, which I thought was a great point. That's the difficulty that young people today face when it comes to race and how they identify not only with, you know, their peers, but how they understand their situation in the country more broadly.
You've all talked about the ability to grasp the nettle and talk about hard things. Are younger Americans more able to do that? I get a lot of feedback from some of the work I do from people of all ages that there's this new idea that talking about these things is racist in itself. If you acknowledge that race shapes life trajectories, shapes various parts of life chances, you're the person who's being racist. And that was a lot of the blowback from a book I wrote on how race shaped the modern city. People said, well, you know, if you dwell on white flight and redlining, then, you know, you keep bringing up race and throwing it in people's face. I'm not sure whether Americans of any age, but let's keep it to young people, are ready to fully acknowledge and have those hard conversations about where it matters and where it doesn't. Victor?
Yeah, so, you know, I think that as a society, in education in particular, we do have an obligation to teach these younger Americans about some of the entrenched, you know, racial and economic inequality that exists today. And that teaching them in the right kind of way really does allow these young people to be open-minded. So for example, about 40% of Black and Latino babies are born in poverty today in America. Only 20% of white babies are born in poverty. No baby should be born into poverty. And so, but there's this huge disparity. Also, mass incarceration is a huge issue in the African American and Latino community. 1 in every 3 young college-age African American males in this country, 1 in 3 is either locked up or under the supervision of the criminal justice system. In California, there are 44,000 college-aged Black men in prison and only 22,000 in college. For Latinos, they're twice as likely to end up in prison than whites. For Blacks, they're 6 times as likely to end up in prison. And this all begins at a very young age, where some people have called the school-to-prison pipeline. A front-page article in the New York Times recently talked about, the title was, "As More Police in Schools, More Kids in Court." And guess who those kids are? Disproportionately over 70% Black and Latino. When my young students hear about this, regardless of who they are racially, they grasp on and say, hey, inequality somewhere is inequality everywhere. And they begin to want to act. And so I think it's our obligation to teach these facts so that young people engage in making change.
Can I just say to that point, you know, I think you make a very interesting point, because what you're talking about really are the byproducts of not talking about the effects of race. You know, it's become very subtle. We might not have to worry about lynching in the way that our parents did, but we do have the prison pipeline. We do have the ways in which redlining impact your economic outcomes. You know, so there's this blowback, you know, as you mentioned earlier, there's this backlash almost on young people of color that sometimes they might not even realize because of what's happened historically in this country and the hidden biases that have, you know, kind of accumulated over time that lead to, you talk about prison, like the prosecutorial discretion even, like how you charge somebody, police discretion, how you decide to arrest somebody or not, based on what they look like. Do I stop this person? Oh, what are they carrying? So all of these factors come into play. And I think it's also compounded by, again, just how we see ourselves in the media or some of the cues we get from the media. You know, you don't have to look far. Just last week with the coverage of the atrocious bombings in Boston, when early reports was that the bombers were dark-skinned individuals. Okay, on what basis? You know, like what's your trigger that says there's been a terrorist attack, it must be a dark-skinned individual, whether that means, you know, you're assuming that they're of, you know, this otherness, right? Like, what causes that? And so I think that also goes into how, you know, youth have to deal with race today. It's just it's a tenuous line that we're facing.
And I think the bottom line is that if parents or politicians are not talking about race, then we would actually be the only ones not talking about race. You're seeing it in the media, you're seeing it in the movies, you're seeing it in music. And that's impacting kids who, I mean, I see 2-year-olds who are playing with iPads. I mean, there is a connectivity that exists today that certainly didn't exist even when I was that age. And we have to acknowledge as policymakers and as people who are in control of parenting our children that these are the influences of what affects child's behavior and affects their self-identity. And we have to be a partner, and we also have to be parents, whether we're the actual parent or maybe the politician-created bureaucracy, to make sure that kids are guided in the right way. Because we know that, for example, we had talked earlier today about how case studies and working with mental health issues and making sure that we understand that kids are not as mentally developed as adults. So to understand the influences, we as parents and as politicians have to be there to support them when tragedies like the Boston Marathon bombings and the media and the music portrays individuals in a certain way. How do they self-identify with how others are portraying them? We have to work with our kids to make sure that they can develop their own self-awareness and their own self-identity.
Christina, you were listening to Victor run through those statistics. And on that beautiful old campus just off Georgia Avenue, that's not the story. No. But does it have an impact on the way people looking from the outside world in at Howard look at black young people, and when black young people who are walking along the hilltop looking out at the world, do they see a different world for themselves because of those statistics? People who are not in the criminal justice system but still have to deal with an image of themselves that's widely shaped by that.
I think it's interesting that you all talk about self-identity because I was so aware of it when I came to Howard and I didn't really think that it would be such an important thing. But I think it definitely comes from what you said of being sort of outside of that statistic. I mean, I grew up, I don't know anyone who's in jail and, excuse me, and I was sort of the token at my school, and you find a lot of people at Howard who also had that story of they were the only black person in their honors class. You know, they had a lot of white friends or just non-minority friends, and you come to Howard and you learn that that's everyone's story, and it's inspiring, and you find out, oh, there are people like me, but you also, there's a tremendous amount of pressure, I think, to sort of solve these problems and fix these statistics and also be the anomaly and represent, you know, we are not all the same. There are people out here doing things. We are trying to change this. So it sort of circles back to what I said in terms of looking for jobs and entering the workforce. There's this responsibility to sort of reach back and make sure that you're not the only one who's succeeding, and that it's not just you at Howard University, a Howard grad, and you go on to be, again, the anomaly in the boardroom, or, you know, the only person speaking for your race. I grew up, you know, in my honors classes, I was responsible for speaking for all of Black people. You know, Christina.
How'd that go?
It was, you know, great, no pressure. It was, Christina, what do you think about this? When we read books about, you know, Richard Wright and things like that, how do you and your people feel about this? And so I think that's where the frustration
Better get
grows.
used to it.
Yeah, I know. I have. I've gotten 21 years of that. I've gotten used to it. But I think that is what is Howard, is people being so aware of that, and it's how you take your field and your passion and your expertise and how you channel that to change it and make sure that I can just be me, a girl who loves journalism and loves to talk to people, instead of this person who is speaking for all Black young Americans. So I think that I don't know if people looking in necessarily get that. I think that we're known for just being a driven campus, but that's where I think that drive comes from. It's more than just, I want to make money, I want to be successful, I want to prove my parents right. It's, I want to see more of me at this table, especially with young Black men. I mean, I always talk about this. Our ratio is depressing, and I think that we as young Black females also need to join those conversations. It shouldn't just be the Black men looking out for the Black men, because, you know, at the end of the day, it's all of us.
And the question becomes, how do you create opportunities also for the young Black men and Black women who are caught in that sort of web of poverty? Because you can show up to university campuses and the people of color represented are people of color that have had opportunities maybe in the household. And so how do you support a population that doesn't necessarily have that support structure? And one of the ways you do that is through social programs. I have the story of being an immigrant with my mother, brought here at age 2, risked our lives to cross the border, got to Oakland, California, lived in poverty, ended up on the streets. I myself dropped out of school, ended up in juvie. But the difference in my transformation was that I encountered social programs. There was teachers, there were mentors, college students, affirmative action, 1985, the Immigration Reform Act. I became a citizen. All these social support webs that I managed to climb into. And so to get young people, particularly young people of color who are in poverty, into these spaces of opportunity, so that we're not burdened with being the only ones representing the entire race. We're going to need lots more social programs out there to really support them making it through and transforming their lives.
If you're interested in the online NewsHour, which is a terrific website anyway, and that you should visit, if you search Victor Rios, it's a very nice story on your life and your career as an academic. Very well told by a short Puerto Rican guy from Brooklyn. I have watched as things that I couldn't have imagined when I was a kid happen over and over again in small ways. So when I see Dennis Haysbert selling insurance on television, beautiful man, great set of pipes. But when I was a kid, a Black man would not sell everybody insurance for their car, their home, and their life. The idea that some ad executive thought, this is a guy who can sell everybody insurance, I think, oh, that's so cool. When happy young people are in a crowd and it looks like the kids at the UN school and they're throwing each other cans of whatever soft drink they're selling and smiling and drinking it, I think, well, that's great because that's an idealistic vision. The ad execs thought that this is a vision that people could get behind, that this would actually sell the soft drink instead of having just one kind or another of people throwing each other the soft drink before wiping off the ice and drinking it. Can you read too much into that? When I see a group of kids that looks like the ad, I think, oh, terrific. It may have been an accident, but it happened. And they don't think it's a big deal at all. So I gotta, help me thread between media-driven perception and reality. If you look at media images, things are a lot better than they were in 1965, 1975, 1985. But I also don't want to overdraw that conclusion.
So yes and no, right? Because when you say better, does numerosity mean better, right? When the images that we see are the real housewives and the basketball wives and, you know, just, not that there's anything wrong with those. I love entertainment, right? I love entertainment, but, you know, where do you see a space for a family of Hispanic Americans, all of whom are college educated? Where do you see a space for a family of Asian Americans who are next door neighbors with a family of African Americans and their friends? You know, it's like, it's, the types of cues that we see are a little bit different. I mean, I think commercials make sense because African Americans and Hispanics alone, with a combined buying power of like $2 trillion, it's just smart business. Sell to people who will buy your product. It's not complicated. But when you really start, you know, kind of peeling back the layers on the types of images we see on television, you have to think about, what are we projecting? What are we forecasting? And it's like, I won't be totally biased and say that we don't also see, you know, craziness for white American too, right? That Honey Boo Boo is now a status symbol. That says something more general about our population and how we like to entertain ourselves and what we deem as valuable media. But I mean, there is this point at which, you know, yes, there's the market power of communities of color and wanting to sell to those communities, but there's also, I think, a breaking point when we say, so what image are we selling? What are we saying it's okay when our girls are being hypersexualized, when boys are told, oh yeah, thug culture is cool? Well, everybody might like a little bit of ratchet activity once in a while, but that shouldn't be your goal. You know, it's like your goal should not necessarily be, let me be the athlete, the entertainer, the drug dealer because they have money. Let me be the doctor, the lawyer, the politician, the community person who's reinvesting into our community. So it's the archetypes that we see that's a problem.
But the nasty little secret about playing with those images on your own body is that it's a very different risk proposition for different Americans. So if you take on the physical trappings of thug life and then at the end of the day get on the train and go home to Rye in Westchester County, it's a very low-risk proposition. You aren't going to be sent up for a long stretch because you dress like that. You aren't going to be picked out by police. You can play with this, take it on and take it off like a set of clothing, where even if you are middle class or upper middle class, it's probably not a good idea in a lot of contexts for a young black man to play with the same images on his own body. It's one thing to choose to look like Tupac and then, you know, go home to Chevy Chase. It's another thing to look like Tupac and then go home to Capitol Heights, where a whole other set of things come into play.
You're absolutely right on that point.
I think the characterizations that you're talking about in terms of the media and advertisements, I mean, we have to acknowledge, you know, what is the competition for that? We also have to say, you know, kids are going to experiment. They're going to try to figure out what their own self-identity is, and that's going to change over time. What are we responsible for in terms of providing the competition to the reality TV shows and to the advertisements? So when we look at kids, I remember a teacher once said to me, you know, you can tell by the time they're in 4th grade how they're going to end up. And I thought, okay, if you can tell by the time they're in 4th grade where they're going to end up, then where's the conversation to say, what are we doing with our children? What are we exposing to them to between birth and 4th grade? So one of the things that we're doing in our school district in Fitchburg, Massachusetts, is we created something called the Ally Program. It's the Advanced Academic Learning Initiative. And what it is, it's breaking down the stereotypes that even I was faced with. Oh, you're an Asian, you're a model minority. Of course you're going to be in AP classes and you're going to be a valedictorian and you probably play the flute and the violin and you know, you're going to be in medicine or in engineering, right? So we're all sort of tasked with these identities.
Were you not those things?
No, I can't play anything. I can't. I can play the radio very well. Well, I'm a politician, so I fought against the stereotypes because I felt the pressure early on of having to fit into something, even if it's a positive stereotype, you still feel the pressure of saying, where's my own self-identity? How do I find my own way? And again, what are the things that we are exposed to when we're very young? And so what we're trying to do is by using the Ally program, the Advanced Academic Learning Initiative, what we're doing is we're saying, you know, we're not going to stick you in an advanced class or an intermediate class or a remedial class. What we're going to say is every single student in our elementary schools, which is pre-K to 4, is good at something. They're better at something than something, you know, whatever it is. If it's music, or maybe they're better at math than science. Whatever it is that we identify in looking at each child as an actual person that they're good at, and that brings them passion, we are going to help accelerate their learning and their self-discovery in that field, instead of isolating them into certain classrooms and giving them labels.
We have microphones set up in the aisles, and we'd love to hear from you. Is it a different kind of pressure? You mentioned that model minority business. If I took AP Calculus, they would have thought a unicorn just walked into the room. You would have to not take it, which is a different kind of pressure, which may be a little bit easier to bear, but have its own complications. I don't know exactly how to tease that thread out, but I do hear with eye rolling and annoyance from East Asians about how those assumptions are burdensome too. Are they really?
They are. I mean, they're burdensome when you are lumped into a group of people that is different from your own personal experience. When you're not seen, when there is cultural and social isolation, those are some of the root causes that we see of many of the problems that emerge later on in life. So if those are things that we can identify in a 4th grader, then we need to figure out how to look at the systems. This is exactly why I'm a politician, by the way, because I said, you know, there's something wrong with the system that I'm in if you are given pathways to success and you are identified within pathways of success or non-success this early on in life. So I remember being in elementary school and thinking, you know, this is something that I want to change. That was my gut reaction to what I was facing. So kids are going to be influenced that early on. And I think if they're saying whether that's the particular pressure they face, there is some sort of pressure that we place on as society. That's why the social programming that Victor talks about is incredibly important for us to say, what kinds of spaces for success and for opportunity and for self-identity can we create? Whether it's the social programs or whether, you know, I as school committee chair and mayor of a community can figure out how to build that into the bureaucracy.
This is an important point because race in America is no longer black and white. And we tend to, in the media and in social science, we tend to reify this notion that it is black and white. And as we see in the statistics, by the year 2050, right, 30% of Americans will be Latino, 10% of Americans will be Asian American. And so what does this mean for the black community too? When an Asian American is constructed as a model minority, it has an impact on, it could have an impact on that young person's well-being, psychological well-being, to have to meet these standards. But also for African American youth, kind of being told, see, you're not the right kind of minority. A recent study showed that in the 131 traditional black ghettos in America, 21% of the population is Latino. In some of them, it's 50, 60%. And so we have to acknowledge the fact that there are these interracial relationships building among blacks and Latinos, and also the tensions that exist. And what does it mean for the black community, for this growing Latino community that has already surpassed them in terms of population numbers in America? And so this will be the question for this generation in the future, is how do we deal with the new racial order? It's not our old racial order where we understand race in terms of black and white and the civil rights struggle, although those were important. But it's a new racial order where we understand race in terms of Obama, Katrina, and immigration and immigration rights struggles.
Gary Segura, whose work I'm sure you know, has written recently about how the way race operates in America is racializing Latinos, even though they don't think of themselves as a race. It's like, If you drive a standard transmission, you got to drive a standard transmission, even though you say, hey, this isn't the way I think of myself, this isn't my thing, and I don't know where the clutch is. You are a race whether you want to be one or not. And members of other racial groups, looking from outside in, are perceiving Latinos a race even when they don't perceive themselves as one.
Well, I mean, I think you raise an interesting point because, you know, race is something we impose on other people. I think individuals more so identify with ethnicity and culture, right? So I'm Bahamian American. If you look at, you know, there's a difference between a Mexican American family in California and a Puerto Rican family in Miami or New York. There's a difference between a Hmong family, Vietnamese, Thai, Chinese. There's a vast array of cultural influences that go into not only shaping identity, but how we interact with the world and the expectations that we have not only of ourselves, but that we think other people have of us. And so if you're coming from this sense of, this is my ethnic background, this is my cultural background, but when I'm faced with the world, all they see is one flat race, that adds a whole different level of complication, which, I mean, I think social programs can help that, but there has to be a broader dialogue about what culture and ethnicity plays in America, this so-called melting pot that never melted, right? It's one of my favorite lines from Tony Kushner's Angels in America. But it's that what role do we actually play in understanding culture as a way to better understand race, and then how people's socioeconomic situation plays on top of all of that.
And another difference with this younger generation is science and genomics. Our generations, if you will, older generations, when we read in the paper, sort of biologists find that there is no scientific base for race, right? There's no evidence that supports that races exist. We might say, oh, wow, you have an epiphany. But when you ask a younger person who's been learning this in their biology class, right, these cutting edge studies about genes and race, that there is no scientific base, that there might be just sort of regional differences in different gene pools, and that our gene pool might be closer to a European American than it is to, let's say, one of my stepbrothers or something like that, right? That this generation, in learning these new scientific changes, will radically alter their understanding of race as well. And maybe it'll be towards the good, but also maybe will create a new racial order that is not so good as well. And it all rests on how we educate this new population regarding race.
Charlie
Firestone from the Aspen Institute. I want to ask Victor Rios, who I believe is still doing work with gangs, basically the state of gangs in America, in the sense of what are are they growing? What are the attractions, to youth for gangs? And is there still the racial tension across gang lines? And finally, what the population of gangs are of whites, among whites and Asians, as opposed to Latinos and blacks.
Okay, all right, I'll try. It's a couple of big questions there. Let's see, I didn't prepare for the statistics here on this, but in terms of my research, so what I find is that the gang becomes a sort of a protective factor for young people that don't have these protective factors, whether it's the family or they encounter schools where there might not be protective factors. And so what happens is that the youth in the community form sort of this street family, right? And so one of the ways I think that we can challenge at least the criminal activity and the violence among gangs is by really focusing on creating environments like schools and community centers and programs that become the protective factors that maybe the kids are looking for in the gang. So that's one answer. And then in terms of gang violence, intraracial versus interracial, let's think of a place like LA where we get a lot of that news. Yes, there's a lot of interracial gang violence, but 95% of gang violence is intraracial, meaning that it's Latino on Latino, black on black. So again, that goes back to sort of an understanding of one's sense of self. There's all these studies out of Stanford, for example, that show that when a young black person is given a test, if they learn about a little bit about, if they talk about racial pride, they'll do better on the test. If they actually start to think about how their race might not be sort of highest in the racial order, or maybe there isn't pride there, they don't do so well on the test. So I think it's important to teach young people about ethnic and racial pride, not so much so that we create these little sort of exclusionary islands in our society, but more so that we gain a deeper sense of self and that we can interact with the rest of the world. In terms of white and Asian American gangs, I know that, yeah, I'm going to have to pass on that. I don't have an answer for you.
You should follow what's going on in Arizona with the teaching of Mexican American history in the schools. A state law was passed in Arizona banning Mexican and Mexican American history from the high school curriculum there. Fascinating. Why it would be thought to be a good idea, how that's all going down. Look into that. It's really interesting stuff.
I wanted to make a comment. I just think it's interesting that we keep going back to the schools. And when I thought about this panel, I really just thought about how much, I mean, obviously I'm still in school, so it's very much my mindset, but how much my educational experience informed how I view race, and how I think for a lot of people who don't have those family structures and those support systems outside of school, there's a lot of that responsibility that lies on our teachers and the people in our institutions to sort of teach our kids about themselves and how they form these identities, which is a tremendous amount of pressure. And I'm glad I don't necessarily have to be the one to do it, but I do think that it shapes everything, and we don't necessarily realize how much it does. I mean, I was standing in the hallway when someone basically went down a line of kindergartners and picked out the kids who would be deemed gifted. And I wasn't one of those. And my mom had to come in and basically argue for me to be chosen, to be tested, to even be given the opportunity to prove myself as a kindergarten. I mean, I don't know if it's determining squares versus circles. I don't know what their criteria is. But from that point on, you're then separated and told you are smarter and you are not, and you are, have more than, and you get these resources. And so I think that a lot of what we talked about of how race, influences how we view ourselves, and that versus culture, I think that all comes from just a human's need to define what they see. And so I think just growing up, especially in a very liberal town in Georgia, which I know seems impossible, it was almost like we won't have these conversations because they're too difficult. But because not having those conversations, when we did have to have them, we only knew of those media images and those really harsh things that were cast down on us to define things that are different from us. And so I think if we start having those conversations early on, and if we sort of break down those harsh dividers that keep us separate, that later on can influence how we can't communicate with each other, and why when things get rough, like with bombings, we don't understand the impact of identifying someone as dark-skinned, and why that can seriously offend a large group of people. So I just think, I think a lot of it starts in the school, and a lot of it's going to happen in the schools, because you can't change how people parent, and it's just like you said with this older population that's sort of getting older. That's not going to change, but what you can affect are the younger people in schools.
And pursuant to your point, not only are the designations of giftedness different, but the designations of learning disabled and developmentally delayed are shockingly different. The percentages of minority children who are very early on, before you're even expressing much about who you are in a measurable way, as when you're 4 and 5 years old, you're separated out from the pack as learning disabled. Yes.
Hi, Anna Smith. Just when I arrived, I wasn't here for the first session. I was asking Charlie about, sort of what the first session was about. One of the things you mentioned was the gap in wealth, this extraordinary gap in wealth, 12 to 1. And so I'm wondering what you're seeing in terms of young people, and understanding certainly the importance of the psychological effects of self-perceptions. I think, you know, Claude Steele's book, Whistling Vivaldi, which cites some of those experiments you're talking to, are very powerful to think about how we think about ourselves as well as how we think about others. But what are their aspirations in terms of social class, in terms of how they see themselves? On what does it mean to them to, what does success mean? What is the sense of moving out of one social class to another? What does income mean? Not to separate the two, but just how do people see themselves making their lives better in this economy?
That's an important question because up until now, a lot of the literature and media portrayals of inner city poor kids is like they have a counterculture. They're, you know, if you do well, you're acting white. And a lot of the new literature and new studies are actually showing that there isn't one culture of poverty. That there's actually many slices of culture in the inner city, that mainstream culture, conventional culture does penetrate into the inner city and into impoverished populations, and it creates these aspirations in them. So the kids that I study, whether it's Oakland, California or Southern California, they all have aspirations. They all want to make it. They all want to go to college. Even some of the more sort of delinquent boys that I study. And the only difference between them and a kid that's actually making it is that they're dreamers and the kids that are making it are strivers. And the way you turn a dreamer into a striver is that you provide them the tools, the specific steps to know how to get to the next level. So the cultural aspirations are there. There is no such thing as this culture of poverty. There's definitely different slices of culture that lead people in the wrong direction, but then within that context and that community, there's also different cultures of aspirations and success that if we tap into, we can broaden the ability of young people to make it through.
One thing that I think is interesting about where you see young people's interest shifting, right? So kind of gone are the days when you want to work for a particular company for 10, 15, 20 years. And I'd say there's an increasing attitude that favors entrepreneurship before a lot of times, and particularly when you're dealing with people who are living in poverty, the question is how? You know, how do you take an idea and turn it into a viable business model? And then where is your support infrastructure around it that makes it possible for you to pursue that idea while you're trying to just live and make ends meet? And that's, you know, it's a possibility that's in some instances a lot less feasible if you don't know where your next meal is coming from versus if you have, you know, parents who are also educated who can help support you, if you have a family who can help provide infrastructure. So that kind of disconnect between an interest in entrepreneurship and, you know, the lack of resources or the lack of understanding of how to get from point A to B is one of those challenges I think, you know, collectively we have to overcome as a community and start saying for people who have made it or for people who have some level of resource, how do you reach back? How do you provide infrastructure, whether it's through information, whether it's through actual capital, whether it's through mentoring? So I think there are a couple of points there that if you support kids' entrepreneurial ambitions, you'll actually see some of the tide changing towards economic outcomes because working at large franchise X might not get the job done, especially when skill sets required to work at large franchise X are different than what they were 5, 10, 15 years ago.
I think also the lack of resources, I mean, obviously this isn't any groundbreaking thing, but it's a dangerous scenario because what I see now is people, not necessarily my age, but younger, like when I go back to elementary schools and I'm reading to kids, is just the desire to want to be successful and how we define success and how that correlates with the media images that are being put out there. So when you mention like Real Housewives and, you know, Love and Hip Hop and things like that, people see those individuals on TV as successful. I mean, they're making money, they, you know, they have fame, they have attention, and they've in some ways separated themselves from whatever community that they came from. And so I think it's a dangerous area to leave a child, you know, without resources or without the tools to actually understand how you can change your surroundings and help those who come from your surroundings, because I think that people just think, well, this person makes X amount of money. Or, and I'm speaking generally, obviously, but I think that it needs to be communicated more that education is important, because I think that people sometimes, my fellow classmates who are in college are just in college because they were told to go. And sometimes it's just a conversation of what income I want to make. And I don't know if that's going to necessarily result in the sort of social change that we're talking about here. So it's just another point.
Sir.
Sure, Floyd Morey with the Asian Pacific American Institute for Congressional Studies.
I don't think your mic is on.
Okay, let's see if we can find out how to turn it on. How do you do it? Anyway,
Well, Boyd, speak in a big, loud voice.
more importantly, I was born in Utah, grew up in rural Utah, and one of the only minorities in the community I grew up. I was raised, I was born before World War II, so my experience as a child was as a World War II Japanese American. And then when I went to college, I was your age, finished college. I went to the Bay Area and became a college professor in the time of the struggle during the 60s. And I hear a lot of young people say today, why do you keep talking about the old days? We're interested in the future. And I'm interested on your perspective. To what degree does that struggle, be it World War II, be it the 50s, 60s, Martin Luther King, what does that mean to you? Does it mean anything to you? Does it guide your values today and what you want to do today or not?
I mean, for me personally, it means a lot, right? So my mom was the first African-American student to integrate both her high school and her college, right? My dad was in the second class of black students to go to his college. And so I have a very visceral connection to that history because it's my personal history, right? I grew up in Florida. I still remember going to, they used to call it the Seminole Festival in Davie, and like sitting around with my friends, all of whom were in the gifted team, and literally people are quacking whips at us in the 90s, right? So I mean, that concept of struggle was something that I've experienced on a personal level, but I'm also 31 years old, right? I can't say that someone who's 21 who doesn't have that same nexus sees it in quite the same way, right? Because with each passing year, it's not like we're teaching civil rights history or black history, Hispanic history, Asian American history, what all these things mean. We're not being taught that in the schools. We don't see it in broad strokes in terms of the media. And so really you have to rely on anecdotes and personal experiences to capture some of that experience unless you're just intellectually curious and you want to go find out information for yourself. So I think it becomes a very personal kind of connection based on what your experiences are.
We're talking about the state of the race in America, but I think there's a different race that we should talk about. There's an education initiative called Race to the Top. And there's this race that everybody seems to be in. We are working longer hours. We are trying to make more money. The aspirations and the values that we hold are, they seem to be fluid, and they seem to be fluid going in the wrong direction. I would say it's incredibly important for us to figure out how our personal history and our collective history actually has, over the course of our history, influenced our actions. Created a common set of values that have really been integral to this democracy. And the American democracy is actually an experiment. When I look at the context, for example, my Chinese heritage, which has been around for a lot longer than China. So I think it's very important for us to figure out how to create those spaces for that. We don't do that when we are teaching to the test in schools. So there are things that we're trying to do from a bureaucratic standpoint. For example, extended learning time so that there is more time in the day to talk about these things, bringing back arts and music and history so that there's an ability for self-expression. And I could go on and on and on, but I do feel like it is a crisis that we are facing. And I'm thinking of George Carlin's eulogy to his wife when he passed away. He's a comedian, but when you're a comedian, I think you're very reflective upon human society, and then you're able to figure out how to translate that and communicate that to the public. But he talked about how we have wider freeways and we have narrower viewpoints. we have taller buildings and shorter tempers. And I think about that often when I think about what is it that we are teaching, and our actions, our bureaucracy, our laws that we pass, you know, who's in leadership, the discussions that we have, all really influence those types of things. So I think that's an important question, and certainly one that I believe is important for us to figure out how to actually say, yes, it is important. Those things are important. Now, how do we create the space for that?
Exactly. And to create the space for that, I think that we have to hook this new generation into understanding the context for those struggles during World War II and internment camps, or the 1960s civil rights struggle, and before that. And one of those hooks is to have them understand, as the great historian and father of multiculturalism, Ronald Takaki, would say, you know, to me, as he was my mentor at Berkeley, he would always say, the past is not even past. And the way you hook people in, this younger generation, is you contextualize how Katrina is not just this incident where this president forgot about an entire population. Katrina is about this larger historical 300 years of history. Or how mass incarceration, right, there's these different phases, whether it's slavery, whether it's Jim Crow, whether it's the ghetto, or whether it's now hyper and mass incarceration. There's these historical flows that we have to understand, and these issues we see today are just the tip of the iceberg. In the early 1990s, Ronald Takaki predicted that one day we would be a minority. All of us would be minorities in this country. And he said, quote, "Our expanding ethnic diversity, a time when we will all be minorities, offers us an invitation to create a larger memory of who we are as Americans and to reaffirm our founding principles of equality. Let's put aside fears of the disuniting of America and warnings of the clash of civilizations. As Langston Hughes sang, quote, 'Let America be America, where equality is in the air we breathe.'"
Final question.
Yes, and some of this might have been addressed in some of your last answer, but how do you, and maybe Christina, this is a good one for you, given your background and your experiences, how do you deal with kind of when you flip the script? By that I mean young kids that are maybe 10 to 1, they don't see a big problem. And the images that they're seeing on TV, whether it's PBS or whether it's the Disney shows, and one short digression, because I have a 9-year-old, and she was talking about this couple on TV, and there was this brown boy, and she said, "That guy, Mom, is the brown boy's dad." And I said, "Oh, they adopted him." She says, no, that's his child." And I was like, "Really?" And I was like, "Well, where's the mom?" "That lady, the brown lady, is the mom." And I still couldn't figure it out. It took me a while to figure out that the white guy was married to the black lady who had a black son from a previous marriage, right? It was my problem. It wasn't their problem, right? So then I'm like, how do I explain this? And I said that out loud, and she was like, "How do you explain what?" So it was my problem again, because she didn't see that. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing? In the context of the guy from Pew who showed us the stats that black people weren't doing as well, but they thought they were, right? So where is the balance? You know, is there an explanation? Do we applaud it? Do we deal with the pride issue and say, this is good, you're achieving, you have a black president? How do you find the balance to keep people thinking in a balanced way?
Some quick answers so we can wrap this up.
I think a lot of that, and this is a good question to follow, comes with tying the yarns of our past and our history to our present and understanding it more on a personal level with anecdotes. I think that was a great point, as opposed to this textbook that I'm reading with these names that I might forget. And so I think that it's probably not a problem that your 9-year-old isn't so aware of all of the racism in the world. And I, you know, as a 9-year-old, I wasn't. I did realize the whole gifted thing, that was a problem for me just because I was being stripped away from this huge group of people. But I also think that it will come up later. And so I think that what's important is, because, you know, by 4th grade, we are sort of the people that we're going to be, which is still insane to me, but it is very true, that those sort of things need to be somehow, even subtly, slipped in early on, so that when you do start thinking about who am I, who are the people around me, how do I, how do I deal with these family structures and these people who are different from me, it's not a shock to you. And you can remember, what mommy explained to me with PBS or things like that, because I do often reflect back on conversations that my parents had with me that I'm sure when I was younger did not really mean anything to me, or the friends that I had. So I think that, it's probably not a problem right now, but it will come up at some point.
Christina, Lisa, Victor, Kristal, thank you all very much.
Thank you.